The Penthouse listing described it as a statement of arrival. Darius Cole thought that was the most honest thing he had ever seen in a real estate advertisement. The Castoria Glass Tower occupied the corner of Hudson and 41st, as if it had been placed there to remind everything around it of the difference between new money and real estate. 42 floors of glass and pale steel, with a lobby that used 3 kinds of marble and employed 4 doormen in matching charcoal livery. The Penthouse occupied the entire 41st floor. Its listing photographs had been taken at dusk by a photographer who understood that real estate was at its core a form of portraiture. You were not showing people a space, you were showing them a version of themselves they had not yet become. Cassandra Vale was inside when Darius arrived. She was the kind of real estate agent who did not hand out business cards at open houses because she did not attend open houses. Her clients came through referral, and her referral network had been built over 10 years, with the specific attention she brought to understanding who mattered in which rooms and what they needed to believe about themselves in order to make an offer. She wore her dark hair back, a pale blazer over her blouse, and she moved through the Penthouse the way she always moved through listings she was proud of, with the slight proprietary pleasure of someone who has built something they are about to give away. She had been in the middle of a conversation with Blake and Madison Harrington when Darius came up in the elevator. Blake was 36, a cryptocurrency-adjacent financier who had made money quickly enough that he had not had time to learn how to hold it without announcing it. Madison, his wife, was 33, and generally follows his lead in rooms like this one, though occasionally she caught herself not following and had not yet decided what to do with that information. Darius stepped off the elevator with Zoe beside him. He wore a gray wool sweater, the elbows softened from use, and dark trousers that fit well. In one hand he held a folder of documents, his financial records, proof of funds, employment verification, the practical armor of a man who has learned to walk into rooms prepared for skepticism. Zoe wore a purple backpack, her hair in 2 puffs, and she held Button, the stuffed rabbit her mother Naomi had given her 2 birthdays before she died. She looked at the Penthouse with wide, slightly overwhelmed eyes, the way children look at spaces that have been designed to overwhelm. Cassandra's smile did not disappear when she saw them. It recalibrated. "Good afternoon," she said. "Are you looking for the building management office?" "It's on the lobby level." "No," Darius said. "I have an appointment at 4. My name is Darius Cole." She checked her tablet. There was, in fact, a 4 o'clock appointment for Darius Cole. This created a small problem, because she had assumed when the appointment was booked through the online system that Darius Cole was a different kind of person. "Of course," she said. "Welcome." The warmth in her voice was now the professional warmth that she produced for all situations, measured, retractable. "You understand this is one of the more demanding listings in the building. I have the documentation you requested," he said, and extended the folder. She did not take it. Blake Harrington, who had been half listening from across the room, said, under his breath but audibly, "Maybe he's here for the staff entrance tour." Madison glanced at Zoe and said nothing. Something passed across her face that she filed away. Cassandra chose not to engage with the comment but also chose not to address it, which was its own kind of choice. She said to Darius, "The qualification requirements for this property are quite specific. I'd hate to put you in an uncomfortable position." Her tone had all the vocabulary of concern with none of its substance. Darius looked at her. "You haven't looked at my documentation yet. I don't need to see a file to understand what a property requires." The sentence sat between them. Zoe, who understood tone before she understood meaning, looked up at her father and then at the floor. Darius did not raise his voice. He said, "You are making my daughter feel like she doesn't belong here. I'd like you to stop." Cassandra had the specific experience of a person who has been named doing something they know they are doing. She maintained her expression. "I'm simply being honest about the property requirements." "You're being honest about your assumptions," he said. "Those are different things." He crouched down to Zoe's level right there on the Italian marble floor with the Hudson River glittering through the floor-to-ceiling glass behind them. "Remember what we talked about," he said quietly. Zoe said very softly, "Don't let other people put a price on us." He touched her cheek. "That's right." He stood, he picked up his folder. "Thank you for your time," he said to Cassandra, with the flat courtesy of someone who has been courteous under worse conditions than this and does not require an audience for it. He took Zoe's hand and they moved toward the elevator. Blake Harrington said, still from across the room, "Probably for the best. Some spaces just fit some people better." Madison looked at her husband. She didn't say anything, but she also didn't laugh. The elevator descended. 40 minutes later, a sound moved through the building's infrastructure. The low electronic pulse of an alarm that was not quite an alarm, the kind that signals a developing problem in a system rather than an immediate emergency. It originated in the mechanical floor of the Harbor House construction project, the building directly across 41st Street from the Astoria Glass Tower, currently in the final months of renovation. Ruth Alvarez, who managed the Harbor House construction site with the combination of precision and controlled irritation that had made her one of the most effective project managers in the Mid-Atlantic region, identified the problem within 3 minutes of the alarm sounding. A cooling system failure in the electrical infrastructure room had triggered a cascade shutdown of the building's automated door controls. 2 workers were in the service stairwell, with the doors locked from both sides. The backup release code was encoded in the master system, which was itself locked. The master code belonged to one person. Ruth called Darius. Darius had just put Zoe in a taxi. He left the taxis, put Zoe back on the sidewalk, picked her up with one arm, and ran. He covered the block between Astoria Glass and Harbor House in 45 seconds. He took the construction entrance at a sprint, holding Zoe against his shoulder, her arms around his neck. Ruth met him at the electrical room door. He set Zoe down, entered the master code at the panel, a 20-digit sequence he had committed to memory, the way he committed all critical things to memory, without writing them down, because memory was the only storage he trusted absolutely, and the building's door system came back online. The workers in the stairwell were free in 90 seconds. No one was hurt. Darius stood in the electrical room and caught his breath. Cassandra Vale was watching from the penthouse. She had seen a man in a gray sweater run across the street carrying a child, enter the construction site, and 60 seconds later, the lights on the Harbor House facade went from amber to white. She watched the workers exit the stairwell. She watched Ruth Alvarez shake Darius's hand with the particular relief of someone who has just avoided a serious incident. She went back to the Harringtons and said, with a calm she did not entirely feel, "I need to make a call." She excused herself and stepped into the service corridor. She called the Harbor House office number, which she'd found in the building permit records she'd filed a complaint about 6 months ago. When the construction had first begun and the Astoria Glass Residents Committee, led by Lionel Grant, who had been trying to kill the project for 18 months, had raised objections about noise and property values and the particular kind of neighborhood change that he preferred to describe as aesthetic concern. A recorded message answered. She looked up the project developer's name on the permit filing, Darius Cole. She stood in the service corridor of the Astoria Glass Tower for a long moment. The view out the corridor window showed the Harbor House building across the street, a structure of approximately the same height as the Astoria Glass, but made from a different vocabulary, brick and poured concrete, warm rather than cold, with large windows and a rooftop that appeared to be designed for gathering rather than display. A banner along the second floor read, "Harbor House, homes for the people keep this city alive." In the lobby of the Astoria Glass, Blake Harrington was telling someone on his phone about the construction site incident in the voice of a man relaying a mildly interesting story. Madison had stopped listening to him midway through and was looking out through the lobby glass at the building across the street. Tell us in the comments where you're watching this from. Stories like Darius's deserve to reach as far as possible. Darius Cole had grown up in a rental apartment in the Bronx where the radiators made zerd sounds at night that his mother said were just the building talking, and he had believed her until he was old enough to understand that buildings make sounds when they are poorly maintained, and poorly maintained buildings are where poor people live, and this arrangement is not an accident. He had studied structural engineering because he understood buildings the way he understood language, as something with a grammar, a set of principles that either holds or doesn't. He had worked for a decade in residential construction and then commercial development, moving through firms of increasing size, learning what made structures last and what made them fail, and accumulating over that period the specific expertise of someone who has been in enough buildings to understand that how a building treats the people inside it is an ethical choice made concrete. He had met Naomi when he was 29, at a community board meeting where she was advocating for a clinic near a low-income housing development, and he had been presenting the renovation timeline for a project next door. She had asked him 3 questions about material safety standards that demonstrated she understood the technical literature better than most engineers he knew. He had asked her to coffee afterward. She had said she didn't drink coffee. He had said neither did he. They had drunk tea across a table in a diner on Amsterdam Avenue for 2.5 hours, and at the end of it, Naomi had said, "You build things. I try to keep the people in them healthy. We're working the same problem from different angles." He had thought about that formulation for weeks. Naomi was a pediatric nurse. She worked long shifts at a hospital in Upper Manhattan, and she came home from those shifts having absorbed the particular weight of days spent with children who were sick and parents who were frightened. And she did not complain about it. She was the kind of person who treated her work as a vocation in the specific sense, not because she was performing devotion, but because she genuinely could not imagine doing anything else. She believed that stable housing was a medical issue. She used to say, "A child cannot heal in a home that keeps threatening to disappear." She had said that at dinner once, when Zoe was 1 year old and sitting in her high chair pulling apart a piece of bread with the focused methodology of someone conducting a scientific experiment. Darius had looked at his daughter and looked at his wife and thought, "I want to build something she would approve of. Not a building for people who don't need protection, a building for people who do." Naomi had died 3 years ago. A sudden cardiac event at 41, at the end of a 12-hour shift. She had not been sick. She had been tired, in the way that people are tired when they have been giving more than the body can replace for a long time, and then she was gone, and the world reorganized itself around her absence in a way that Darius was still, 3 years later, navigating. He had begun the Harbor House project 6 months after she died, not because he needed to do something with his grief. He was not the kind of man who confused productivity with healing, but because he had been planning it with her, and it felt wrong to stop. The project was this, a 12 stories residential building, 1 block from a major hospital, designed for the people who worked in the city's essential services and could not afford to live near where they worked. Nurses and teachers and EMTs and building maintenance workers and restaurant workers in hospital cafeterias and school aides, and the people who in the normal accounting of urban real estate were essential to the city's functioning and systematically priced out of its geography. The rents would be subsidies through a combination of municipal grants, private foundation funding, and a development model Darius had spent 2 years building. The building would have a community room, an after-school study space, a small medical consultation office staffed 3 afternoons a week, a shared garden on the roof. It would have 1 entrance. Not a front entrance and a service entrance. 1 entrance, for everyone. He had almost not gotten the permits. Lionel Grant, the chairman of the Astoria Glass Residents Association, had filed 3 formal objections with the city planning board, citing concerns that ranged from the legitimate construction noise, traffic disruption, to the transparently motivated. The city had approved the project. Lionel had filed again. The city approved again. Lionel had then apparently decided that what the regulatory process hadn't accomplished, he would attempt through other means. This was what Ruth uncovered in the week following the electrical incident. The cooling system failure had not been caused by construction error. The connection in the electrical room had been physically interrupted, a deliberate manipulation that required someone to have accessed the room during a period when the site was closed. Security camera footage for the 2 days before the incident was missing. The camera covering the room's external access point had been blocked with a piece of material from the Astoria Glass building's own maintenance storage, a detail that the independent safety inspector noted in his report with the specific, careful understatement of someone putting a very large implication into very small words. Ruth brought the findings to Darius. He looked at the report for a long time. He had built 23 projects in his career. He had dealt with delays, with financing gaps, with contractors who underbid and then renegotiated, with city processes that moved slowly enough to make reasonable people unreasonable. He had not dealt with this before, and he sat with it in the particular way that people sit with evidence of deliberate malice, not with rage, but with a kind of tired recognition, because the pattern was not entirely unfamiliar. "We bring this to the city," he said. Ruth said, "The board hearing is in 2 weeks. Then we bring it to the board hearing." Zoe was in the corner of the site office doing her homework. She had been coming to the construction site on Saturdays for 2 years, ever since Naomi died, because the site office had a small desk in the corner that Ruth had put there specifically for her. Zoe liked the sounds of the building going up. She said once that it sounded like the building was learning to breathe. She looked up from her homework. "Is the building going to be okay?" she said. Ruth said, "Yes." Darius said, "We're going to make sure of it." Zoe went back to her work. The city planning board met on a Thursday morning. The hearing room was on the 9th floor of a municipal building that's of recycled air and old carpet, and it was full. Harbor House supporters on one side, Lionel Grant's coalition on the other, media in the back, and on the dais, 7 board members who had been doing this long enough to recognize when a zoning dispute was being used to conduct a different argument entirely. Ruth presented the safety investigation findings. She was specific and she was technical and she did not editorialize, which was its own form of eloquence. The independent inspector's report spoke for itself, particularly the sentence about the maintenance material from the Astoria Glass building. Lionel Grant presented his objections. He spoke about property values and community character and what he called the aesthetic coherence of the Suds corridor, which was the most refined version of his actual concern that he was willing to produce in a municipal hearing room. Darius spoke last. He did not speak about Lionel Grant. He did not speak about the Astoria Glass Tower or Cassandra Vale or the afternoon in the Penthouse. He spoke about Harbor House, what it was, why it existed, who it was built for. What Naomi had said about children who could not heal in homes that kept threatening to disappear. He spoke about the nurse who had called Ruth the morning after the board meeting invitation was published, asking whether the application was still open, because she had been driving 45 minutes each way to her shift for 3 years, and she was tired in a way that she could feel in her body, and she had a daughter who was 6, and needed more of her than the commute was leaving. The board voted 4-3 to deny Lionel's petition, and confirm the project's approval with an additional independent safety oversight requirement, which was in the circumstances a reasonable condition Darius accepted without argument. Lionel Grant's communications, examined by the city's ethics office as part of the broader review, included an email to the maintenance contractor whose employee had been identified as having accessed the Harbor House site. The email did not explicitly direct anyone to do anything illegal. It said, "I need a documentation of a safety failure," sufficient for the ethics office to recommend his removal from the Residents Association Board pending investigation. Blake Harrington contacted Darius 2 weeks after the hearing. He had, in the interim, watched the media coverage and read the board decision, and concluded that Harbor House was going to be a story with a positive ending, and that positive endings in real estate had a way of generating value. He called himself a community-minded investor. He said he would like to discuss participation. Darius said no. Blake said, "Because of the Penthouse? I'd like to move past that." Darius said, "Not because of the Penthouse. Because you saw what this building was for, and you only saw opportunity after someone else confirmed it had value. That's not the kind of capital this project is built on." Blake had nothing to say to that. He ended the call. Cassandra Vale had been quieter since the city hearing. She had given testimony. She had been contacted by the safety investigation because of her position in the building during the incident, and the testimony had required her to describe, accurately, what she had observed through the penthouse window. She had done so. It had been, from the investigation's perspective, useful. From her own perspective, it had been an exercise in sitting in a municipal hearing room and recounting, in official language, an afternoon she would rather not have been part of. She came to the Harbor House construction site 3 weeks before opening. Darius was there reviewing the final punch list with Ruth. Cassandra stood on the sidewalk outside the construction entrance in clothes considerably less formal than what she had worn in the penthouse. Jeans, a dark jacket, good boots, and she asked if she could come in. Darius looked at her for a moment. He nodded. She walked through the building slowly. She was not performing admiration, which was the thing that would have made Darius end the visit. She was looking at the corridor widths designed to accommodate wheelchairs without feeling clinical, at the windows sized for light rather than view, at the community room with its long tables and its bulletin board space and its kitchen alcove, at the sign on the main entrance that said Harbor House in plain block letters. No tagline, nothing to perform. She said, "I told a man he wasn't the right fit for a building because of what he was wearing. I've been selling that idea for 10 years. I called it standards. I think I was selling exclusion and calling it a lifestyle." Darius said, "You were." She absorbed this without deflecting. "I know," he said, "knowing it doesn't fix the 10 years. "No," she said, "it doesn't." She looked around the community room. "I don't know what I can offer you. You don't need my help. But if there's a fair housing compliance process I can support, or if the leasing needs someone who can actually help you find tenants equitably, I don't know if you'd trust me with that." Darius was quiet. He said, "Trust is not a vacant apartment. You can't walk in just because the door is open today." She accepted this. She did not press. She left a contact card with Ruth on the way out, which was not presuming on Darius's time, but not walking away either, and Darius, watching her go through the window, thought, she has a long way to walk. Maybe she's starting. Harbor House opened on a Saturday in October. The weather was overcast and mild, the specific kind of autumn day that feels like a held breath. There was no red carpet. There was no champagne. There was a folding table near the entrance with coffee from a neighborhood diner and a box of pastries that Ruth had ordered from a bakery on the next block. And there were about 60 people in the lobby and on the sidewalk, a mix of incoming residents, structure workers, community members, neighbors, and several reporters who had been covering the project. On the wall behind the reception desk, a framed panel read, Harbor House Safe Homes for the People Who Keep the City Alive, in memory of Naomi Cole. Zoe stood in the lobby looking at her mother's name. She reached up and held her father's hand. The residents moved in over the course of the day. A pediatric nurse who had been doing the 45-minute commute with the 6-year-old daughter. A third-grade teacher who had been renting a room in a co-living arrangement since her lease expired and could not find anything affordable near her school. A firefighter who was raising his son alone after his wife left. A grandmother raising her 2 grandchildren while her daughter finished a nursing program. A hospital kitchen worker who had been sleeping on a friend's couch for 4 months. Zoe helped at the desk for an hour, handing out keys with the ceremonious gravity of someone who understands that a key is not a small thing. Daddy, she said, after the 4th resident had taken their key and walked toward the elevator, with the specific expression of someone who has been held in suspension for a long time and is finally moving again. Why do they all cry? Darius said. Because sometimes a key doesn't just open a door. It closes a long list of fears. Zoe thought about this. She turned the spare key in her hand, the key to the apartment they would move into, 1 floor up, small but full of light, close to her school, close to where Naomi had worked. Is this our key too? She said. He said. She pocketed it with the seriousness of someone completing a ritual. That afternoon, a delivery worker made a wrong turn and came through the Harbor House entrance, checking the sign against his phone, obviously uncertain. Sorry, he said. Is this? Am I supposed to go around back somewhere? Darius, standing near the entrance, said, No. The front door is for everyone. The young man looked at him, slightly startled, then relieved, and continued toward the elevator. Zoe, who had heard this from across the lobby, looked at her father. She was 8 years old, and she had been in the penthouse on 41st Street when someone had told her father, and by extension her, that there were spaces they did not fit. She remembered the marble floors. She remembered how the light had come through the floor-to-soiling glass. She remembered wanting to leave. She did not want to leave here. Later, when Darius and Zoe were in their own apartment, smaller than the penthouse by 3/4, with a kitchen that fit 2 people only if they moved carefully, and a window that looked east rather than at the river, Zoe stood at the window and looked across the street at the Astoria glass tower, which was still there, still pale and gleaming, and 42 stories have arrived. Daddy, she said, the other building is taller. Yes, he said, but this one feels more like home. He put his arm around her shoulders. I think so too, he said. There are buildings constructed to make people look up, and there are buildings constructed to finally let people breathe. The difference is not always visible from the street. It lives in the width of the corridor, in the size of the single entrance, in the sign that says everyone and means it. Darius Cole was turned away from a penthouse on 41st Street because a woman who had spent a decade learning to read rooms read him wrong. She saw his sweater. She saw his folder. She saw the child with the stuffed rabbit and the brace of something that was not poverty, but was not wealth either. And she read all of it in a second and drew a conclusion, because that was how she had been trained to operate. She was not alone in this. The building next door had an entire governance structure dedicated to preserving the conditions under which her conclusion would remain permanently available to be drawn. They called it standards. They called it values. They called it protecting the integrity of a community. What it was a door. Darius did not force the door. He did not perform his wealth or his expertise or his $2 billion net worth in equivalent projects because he did not believe that was how dignity was established. He walked across the street and he opened a different door. One that was there when the others weren't. One that had no service entrance because it had decided, at the design level, that there would only be one way in. And Zoe, who was 8 years old and had already understood something about rooms that do not want her, looked out at the gleaming tower on the corner and felt, for the first time, that she was on the right side of the glass. Not the tallest side, not the most expensive side, the side where someone built a door that does not ask you to prove you deserve to walk through it.